Buy a bottle of Heinz ketchup in an American grocery store and buy a bottle of Heinz ketchup in a British or European one and check the ingredient list on each. Same brand, same red bottle, same iconic logo, but a different sweetener sitting near the top of the ingredient list. American Heinz ketchup is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. British and most European Heinz ketchup is sweetened with regular sugar made from sugar beets or cane. Every other video on this channel has been about a health or safety regulation drawing a line between two markets. This one's genuinely different, and it's worth understanding exactly how, because the reason for this specific gap has almost nothing to do with anyone deciding one sweetener is safer than the other. It's a story about decades of agricultural trade policy on both sides of the Atlantic, two governments each protecting a different domestic industry, and how those two separate protectionist decisions ended up producing two completely different default sweeteners in the same global brand's ketchup recipe. Let's start with what high fructose corn syrup actually is, because it's often discussed as though it's some exotic synthetic invention, when it's really a processed derivative of an extremely common crop. Cornstarch is broken down through an industrial wet milling process into glucose using enzymes to convert the starch into simple sugar. A portion of that glucose is then further processed with a different enzyme that converts some of it into fructose, producing a syrup that's a mix of glucose and fructose in varying ratios depending on the specific product. The version used in most sodas, generally called HFCS 55, runs about 55% fructose, while the version more commonly used in baked goods and condiments like ketchup, HFCS 42, actually contains less fructose than that, around 42%, which, and this surprises a lot of people, is genuinely comparable to, or in some cases even lower than, the fructose content of ordinary table sugar, since sucrose itself is chemically about 50% fructose and 50% glucose bonded together. Now let's look at why the European Union version of so many products, ketchup included, defaults to cane or beet sugar instead. The European Union, under its Common Agricultural Policy, has regulated sugar production since the 1970s through a quota system, a policy tool that set strict caps on how much of various sweeteners could be produced within the European Union each year. Beet sugar, grown extensively across northern and central Europe, was the dominant sweetener the European Union's agricultural policy was built to protect. And the quota system specifically capped isoglucose production, isoglucose being the European Union's regulatory term for what Americans call high fructose corn syrup, at a deliberately small fraction of the overall European Union sweetener market, far below what corn processing capacity could have supplied if left unrestricted. This wasn't a food safety measure in any sense. It was straightforward agricultural protectionism designed specifically to shield the European Union's substantial beet sugar farming and processing industry from cheaper corn-based competition, in much the same spirit as the European Union protects specific regional food names we have covered in other videos, just applied to a raw commodity rather than a finished product's name. That quota system remained in place for decades, meaning European food manufacturers building their supply chains and recipes throughout that entire period simply did not have meaningful commercial access to cheap, abundant isoglucose the way American manufacturers did with corn syrup. Sugar beet and cane sugar became, by default, the sweetener. European recipes were built around not because of any deliberate decision that it was healthier or higher quality, but because it was what was actually available and price competitive under the regulatory system in place. Here's the detail that a lot of people get wrong about this story, though. The EU's sugar and isoglucose quota system was actually abolished in October 2017 as part of a broader reform of the Common Agricultural Policy. Legally, EU food manufacturers have had full freedom to use as much high fructose corn syrup or isoglucose as they want in their products for years now. There is no legal restriction on it today and has not been since that quota system ended. What's kept European ketchup and a huge range of other European packaged foods sweetened with cane and beet sugar since then isn't law. It's inertia. Decades of built supply chains, established supplier relationships, consumer taste expectations formed over generations, and manufacturing infrastructure all built around beet and cane sugar don't reverse themselves just because a quota gets lifted on paper. The shift toward isoglucose in Europe since 2017 has happened, but slowly and unevenly, concentrated more in certain industrial food and beverage categories than in something as recipe sensitive and brand identity driven as ketchup. Now, here's the part of this story that makes it a genuinely different kind of comparison than anything else we've covered on this channel, because the United States has its own version of exactly this same protectionist playbook, just aimed at a different target with the opposite practical result. The US operates its own sugar program, administered through the Farm Bill, which uses import tariffs and quotas to restrict how much lower-cost sugar can be imported from other countries, combined with price support mechanisms for domestic American sugar beet and cane growers. The practical effect of that policy has been to keep domestic U.S. sugar prices meaningfully higher than world market sugar prices for decades, a gap that food manufacturers, always looking for the lowest cost ingredient that does the job, noticed and responded to starting in the 1970s and 1980s. Right around the same period that industrial corn processing technology had advanced enough to make high fructose corn syrup a cheap, stable, mass-producible sweetener. With domestic sugar kept artificially expensive by one branch of U.S. agricultural policy, and corn production simultaneously subsidized and supported by a completely different branch of that same policy, HFCS became the obvious price-driven substitute for a huge share of the American food and beverage industry, and adoption spread rapidly across sodas, condiments, baked goods, and packaged foods throughout the 1980s. It's worth understanding the corn side of this equation a little more too, because high fructose corn syrup adoption in the US was not purely a response to expensive domestic sugar, and it was also actively pulled forward by decades of separate federal support for corn production itself. U.S. corn has received substantial federal subsidy support since the Great Depression era, originally aimed at stabilizing farm income and ensuring a reliable domestic grain supply, and that long-running support helped keep corn abundant and cheap relative to many other crops throughout the 20th century. When industrial enzymatic processing technology matured in the 1970s, making it commercially viable to convert cornstarch into a stable, storable sweetening syrup at scale, American food manufacturers found themselves with two separate federal policies pointing in the exact same direction at once: expensive protected sugar on one side, cheap subsidized corn on the other, and high fructose corn syrup was the product that sat precisely at that intersection, benefiting from both policies simultaneously rather than just one. So here is the actual shape of this story. The European Union protected its beet sugar industry by directly restricting the competing product, isoglucose, for decades. The United States protected its own domestic sugar growers by restricting cheaper imported sugar instead, which had the indirect, almost accidental effect of making corn syrup the more attractive substitute for manufacturers trying to control costs. Two different governments, two different protectionist tools aimed at defending two different domestic agricultural industries, and the result is two entirely different default sweeteners sitting in the same global brand's identical product, depending purely on which side of the Atlantic it is manufactured for. It's also worth noting that the 1980s high fructose corn syrup transition in the US didn't happen only in ketchup and condiments. It was a genuinely sweeping shift across almost the entire American packaged food and beverage industry within a remarkably short window. Coca-Cola and Pepsi both switched their US formulations from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup in the mid-1980s. That change is significant enough that it is still specifically referenced today by soda enthusiasts seeking out Mexican Coke or Passover season Coca-Cola, both of which are typically produced with cane sugar rather than corn syrup. This created a small but persistent specialty market built entirely around that one ingredient swap decades later. Ketchup followed the same broad industry shift as beverages, condiments, and baked goods across the board, all converging on the same cost-driven substitution around the same period for the same underlying farm bill and corn policy reasons. Heinz itself is genuinely the cleanest real-world example of this entire dynamic playing out inside a single company's product line. UK and most European Heinz ketchup has consistently used sugar rather than high fructose corn syrup, consistent with the ingredient economics available in that market, while standard US Heinz ketchup has used high fructose corn syrup for decades, consistent with American ingredient economics. It's become common enough knowledge among people who've lived in or traveled between both markets that a small but genuine import market exists specifically for people seeking out the other country's version of a condiment they grew up with, entirely because of this sweetener difference rather than any change in the core recipe itself. Now, the health and taste question, because this is where a lot of online discussion of high fructose corn syrup runs well ahead of what the actual science supports, and it's worth being precise rather than just repeating whichever version of this claim is more popular. On the health side, the scientific consensus is genuinely more nuanced than most casual discussion of this topic suggests. Once consumed, sucrose, ordinary table sugar, breaks down in the body into roughly equal parts glucose and fructose. High fructose corn syrup 42, the type most commonly used in ketchup and similar products, arrives already split into glucose and fructose in a very similar ratio, actually containing slightly less fructose proportionally than table sugar in some formulations. This specific point trips people up constantly because the public conversation around high fructose corn syrup has, for years, treated it as though it's chemically or nutritionally quite different from ordinary sugar, when the actual molecular composition of the two, particularly for the high fructose corn syrup 42 variant used in condiments rather than the high fructose corn syrup 55 used in soda, is genuinely close. Multiple nutrition science reviews have found that at the sugar-to-sugar level, metabolically, the two sweeteners behave quite similarly in the body once digested, and several researchers have specifically pushed back on the idea that high fructose corn syrup is meaningfully more harmful than equivalent sucrose at comparable consumption levels. That said, this remains a genuinely researched and debated question rather than a fully settled one, and some researchers have pointed to differences in absorption speed and metabolic pathway between the two sweeteners as worth further study, and broader concern about total added sugar intake from any source. High fructose corn syrup or sucrose alike remains well supported regardless of which specific sweetener a product uses. If you're looking for a simple, confident verdict that one is clearly worse than the other, the current research doesn't really support handing you one. On the taste side, this is much more subjective territory, but it's a real and widely reported consumer perception. Rather than pure marketing invention, many people who've tried both versions of the same product report the cane or beet sugar version tasting cleaner, less aggressively sweet, or lacking a faint aftertaste some describe in the corn syrup version. Food scientists have offered some plausible explanations for this, subtle differences in how the two sweeteners interact with a product's other flavor compounds, and simple, powerful expectation and nostalgia effects for people who grew up with one specific version. But this remains genuinely anecdotal territory rather than an objectively measured, universally agreed upon difference. So practically, here's what you can actually check the next time you're comparing ketchup bottles. Check the ingredient list directly for high fructose corn syrup versus sugar, cane sugar, or beet sugar. This is the one piece of information that will tell you definitively which sweetener you're getting, regardless of country of origin or brand marketing. If you specifically want the non-high fructose corn syrup version of a familiar American brand, know that some major US manufacturers, Heinz included, have introduced dedicated non-high fructose corn syrup product lines directly in response to sustained American consumer demand. Simply Heinz, sweetened with sugar rather than corn syrup, is sold right alongside standard Heinz ketchup on many US shelves. This is yet another example of the same pattern we've seen across this entire channel, a voluntary market-driven alternative appearing on shelves without any actual change to federal regulation forcing it. This channel compares food and product standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EU Common Agricultural Policy, sugar quota history, US Farm Bill sugar program documentation, and published nutrition science reviews. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not medical advice. Trade policy and product formulations change over time, so always check current labels and official sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by Heinz, Kraft Heinz Company, or any other brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're heading to the cereal aisle for one of the strangest demonstrations in this entire series, the literal iron filings some US cereals use for fortification, and why you can actually pull them out of a bowl with a magnet. Subscribe if you want to see exactly how that works.